This is the third video in a series on the God of the Old Testament. In the first one, we looked at Adam and Eve and what transpired in the Garden of Eden. In the second, we looked at Abraham, the father of the faithful, and his son Isaac. And today, we will look at Moses and his authorship of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The Bible says that Moses received at least some of what he passed on in those books during a long, lone vigil up on Mount Sinai in the Arabian desert. The books say that Moses spoke face to face with God while there, that fire and smoke came out of the mountain, that Moses went without eating or drinking for 40 days, and then he did it again for another 40 days. And finally, it says that when he came down from the mountain, he had 2 tablets of stone on which Jehovah himself had supernaturally written some rules which perfectly declared the will of God for mankind throughout all of human history. Somehow, those 10 sacred rules on those tablets of stone miraculously grew into 5 fairly long books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, variously called the Torah, the Law, the Pentateuch, or the Books of Moses. These books recounted things that happened ever since the first man and woman were created, including the ages at which various individuals died over a period of thousands of years. They also included the exact number of people in various Hebrew tribes and families during 2 censuses. They included precise details for the construction of an elaborate cloth temple, which could be put together and taken apart as they journeyed around in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. And they included literally hundreds of rules about how to live, such as what kinds of foods to eat and what not to eat. Finally, they included severe punishments for people who broke some of the rules. In many cases, the punishment was death by stoning. All of this was believed to have been dictated word for word by God himself, directly to Moses. No details are given about how and when the transition happened between the rules written on the 2 stones and the appearance of the 5 books. The 5th book, Deuteronomy, even finishes with a description of Moses' death, which almost certainly had to have been written by someone besides himself. Language experts have examined the documents as they appear today, as well as studying what evidence we have for the dates on which they were written, and they have concluded that 4 or 5 different writing styles appear in the books of Moses. These experts have been inclined to believe that the books were put together over a period of at least 100 years, with the first of them having been written more than 500 years after Moses passed away. Die-hard fundamentalists, both in the Jewish religion and in Christianity, insist that the experts have it wrong. Some of them even insist that it was Moses who wrote that passage about his death, because he only needed to write, word for word, what God had told him to write anyway, since God knew ahead of time what would happen after he finished writing. In other words, Moses wrote what he was told to write about his own death, and then he went off and died. Before I go on to talk about the 10 Commandments in particular, I want to say something personally about the debate over when the Pentateuch or Torah was written and what role God and/or Moses had in writing it. Even though I find the census statistics, the genealogies, details of the construction of the tabernacle, and most of the health rules to be incredibly boring, they do tend to add credence to my belief that these first 5 books of the Bible are more than myths and legends. It is hard to believe that anyone would go to the great lengths that someone went to in writing all of that stuff down if it never happened somewhat in the way the books themselves say it happened. Other religions have their myths and legends, but they just tell it as straight dogma. Their followers must take it all in blind faith. Whether talking about Zeus, about Gaia, or about Krishna, one just gets a declaration that such and such is true, and they are never expected to question their religious leaders beyond that. The stories, like their idols, are seen as having dropped straight out of heaven, complete and perfect in themselves, never to be questioned. The strict fundamentalist approach seems very similar to the approach of such pagan religions. That is, that the Bible just dropped out of heaven, and we are never to question anything about it. Yet I believe that we have a right and a responsibility to ask hard questions about the origins of these stories. That doesn't mean that I've rejected them as false. I personally find many of the anomalies in the Torah to be helpful in convincing me that the Old Testament was not simply made up. Let me give you an example. In the genealogies, it talks about some people before the flood living to be 800 or 900 years old. No explanation is given, just simple declarations. All the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. That's it. Just 969 years, and he died. One even needs to calculate for themselves to work out from the evidence that Methuselah died in the same year that the Torah says the flood occurred. He must have been one of the unbelieving victims of the flood. Surely, if someone was making this up, they would have at least given an explanation for why people lived so long before the flood and why their lifespan only became more consistent with what we experience today after the flood. But no apology or explanation is given. It's as though the records were first written at a time when people saw nothing unusual about someone actually living that long. Here is another bit of evidence that is counterintuitive, but which makes me trust those 5 books more. There are discrepancies in several of the census statistics where the figures are listed twice. Certainly a fiction writer would have altered one version or the other to produce consistency, or more likely, they would have just produced one list instead of 2 to avoid the possibility of a contradiction. It is also remarkable that no one has tried to doctor up the contradictions over the centuries. These sort of glitches make me appreciate the honesty of the Bible as a whole, not just the Old Testament, even if it does not convince me of its infallibility. But I still believe that a fundamentalist approach to the Bible has given us a distorted view of the real God behind the Old Testament. Fundamentalists have set out to trap God inside a book, turned the book into an idol, and then outlawed any hope of there eventually being a more reliable revelation of God's will for mankind. I have no problem believing that God spoke to Moses when he was up there on the mountain, and I have no problem with Moses coming down and sharing what he received. But I also have no problem with believing that the story may have grown over the years and that people started exaggerating things as the stories got passed on by word of mouth. And then there are the genealogies. I really don't know about them. Maybe God went to the trouble of giving Moses all of that information just to convince us that it is more than myths and legends. Or maybe someone came across other ancient records which they incorporated into what Moses revealed. Like I already said, things like endless genealogies do not seem to be the kind of details that a fiction writer would bother to include. But the real point is that I don't personally need the genealogies in order to have faith in a creator God who is deeply interested in the people whom he has created. What I believe the real God of the Old Testament wants us to do is to stay forever open to greater revelation of his will for us. Like a good scientist, we need to build on the best available evidence from the past, at the same time that we learn from further experimentation in the present. If we can leave the flood and other stories from the Old Testament for a bit, I would like to especially focus on the stone tablets, the ones that the descendants of Israel are said to have carried around the desert with them in an elaborately decorated box called the Ark of the Covenant, or the box with the rules in it, if you want to use more plain English. There is no mention in the Torah about the huge stack of scrolls that would have made up the rest of the Torah. We don't hear about them being put in that box, or in any other sacred place for that matter. But the children of Israel did, according to the biblical records, give special treatment to the stones on which they said that God Himself wrote. Those 10 rules seem to stand head and shoulders above the rest. The bad news is that someone lost the box, and with it the stones inside, a very long time ago. For all intents and purposes, the tablets on which the 10 Commandments were originally written no longer exist. But not to worry, someone apparently wrote them down on parchments, twice. One supposedly word-perfect, infallible record of what appeared on those stone tablets is in the 20th chapter of Exodus, and the other supposedly word-perfect, infallible record of what appears on those stone tablets is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. But there is one small problem. The two records are different. Not in any big way. They both essentially say the same thing, which, by the way, is a lot longer than what you learned in Sunday school. So either the stones on which all 10 commandments were written were quite huge, much bigger than what Moses would have been able to carry, or God used a fairly small type font when He did His stone carving. Nevertheless, the two accounts of what they said are different. I'm going to show you a comparison between the two versions for just one of the 10 commandments to give you a better picture of how long they were, but also to give you a better picture of how they were the same and how they were different. Take time to note both the similarities and the differences, even if you have to pause the video. For me, the differences are not a big problem. Two people writing from memory could differ a bit in what they remembered. Why, even one person writing at 2 different times might remember it a little differently. But this is a very big problem for some people, and those are the ones who believe that these records did not come from 2 different people, or even from one person's recollection at 2 different times. They believe that these passages come from the actual mouth of God. They were, according to the fundamentalists, dictated by an infallible and all-knowing God, word for word. The same God who literally set the original version in concrete. Nothing can be changed, for their God never changes, and He has perfectly protected the infallibility of what He breathed into those parchments or stones or whatever so many centuries ago. For a lot of people, myself included, that just doesn't make sense. God seems to have lost the stones, and then He has contradicted Himself by giving us 2 different accounts of what the stones originally said. But if it wasn't God who gave us those 2 different versions, then why, oh why did the fiction writers, whom the experts say made up the whole story, including a legendary Moses, why didn't they fix up the 2 versions, or limit themselves to just one account? It makes no sense for a counterfeiter to have left such a glaring discrepancy about the stone tablets, when it is the authorship of those same rocks that forms the basis for the whole infallibility argument about the Torah, the Old Testament, and the entire Bible. All of this is an important lead-up to my slowly evolving understanding about the God of the Old Testament. See, I have concluded that the real God of the Old Testament does not feel we need a perfect list of rules. He was communicating with imperfect people after all, and almost anything was better than nothing. These imperfect people were not likely to be open to hearing everything that he wanted to say anyway. So the point was just to steer them in the right direction, as far as they, or Moses or their leaders, were prepared to go at the time. He could give them enough information to get by, and then just watch what they would do with it. This is understandable when you realize that most of us don't really want to hear everything that God has to say anyway. We are pretty close-minded, even on our best days. Jesus referred to this specifically when he made mention of Moses writing about divorce. Moses had told the husbands of his day that they could get rid of any wife who displeased them just by putting it in writing that the marriage was ended. And Jesus had the audacity to say that Moses was wrong, that it was not Jehovah's perfect will for men to do that. But, Jesus explained, Moses wrote that because of the hardness of the people's hearts. Jesus was saying that God himself needed to limit what he revealed to Moses in the Torah based on what the people were able to hear. So, it's possible, in my opinion, that the genealogies were put there as helpful evidence that God really was speaking to Moses, or perhaps to someone else, at the same time that they illustrated that he was limited, or perhaps they were limited, in what they could absorb of his bigger plan for mankind. So much of what appears in those first 5 books, the census, and the number of wooden rivets in the tabernacle, and whether it's okay to wear wool and cotton at the same time, most of that is really quite trivial. We could live and die perfectly well without it. Many millions of people have done so already. Even the whole New Testament was not made available to the general public until sometime after Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press. But at each step along the way, people had enough to work with, and God has been able to weigh each of us up based just on what we do with what we know. Many of those first Christians did much better with the snippets that they had than what we do today with scores of different versions of 66 different books translated into 100 different languages. To whom much is given, Jesus said, much more will be required. So what are we doing with what we have? That is the real question. Fundamentalists have tried to cram the infinite God of eternity inside a comparatively puny little book, and then tried to lock him in there, thus giving us a distorted picture of the real God whom Abraham discovered before any books existed. The so-called God of the Old Testament is a crippled distortion of the God of eternity, not because he was incomplete then, but rather because the people through whom he spoke were incomplete. In the New Testament, followers of Jesus have the courage to come right out and say that the law came through Moses, from Yahweh to be sure, but through Moses, and perhaps through others as well along the line, and thus limited by their own imperfections. Moses may have been way ahead of others of his time, but he was not the only begotten Son of God, the Word made flesh, as depicted in the New Testament. Moses was, in a word, fallible. God gave us humans the freedom to play with the rules, to embellish them, to add our own interpretations, and then, to top it off, he gave us the freedom to declare that what we put together, based on how much we were open to hearing, is the final, perfect, and complete revelation of God. That is, of course, exactly what people have been doing since the days of Moses. But it does not make us right. As someone has said, man too often creates a God in his own image. It remained for Jesus to come along and set us straight on what the Father really is like, even if some of the things that Jesus said have also been distorted or misunderstood by those who claim to be following him. Through it all, God has not changed. but our understanding of him has. He was the same loving God in the Old Testament that we see in the New Testament, but his image has been distorted through the minds and words of fallible human beings along the way, both then and now, with our inflated opinions about how perfectly we have constructed the various boxes in which we try to put him. Very briefly, I want to use that one commandment that we looked at more closely earlier in this video to illustrate how so much of the Torah has been used to disfigure Jehovah and turn him into something that he never was. The commandment tells us to rest, at least one day in every 7. It stands out from all the other 9 commandments in that it is not asking people to perform. It is, in fact, a demand that they periodically stop all their work and just rest. Lean back and smell the roses. Admire God's handiwork and thank him for all that he has done. But even that rest has been turned into a religious rat race, with people all over the world arguing with each other over the details, trivial details that have nothing to do with the original rule. Jesus was badgered about that rule throughout his entire public ministry. On one occasion, he argued that his Father works every day, and so does he. But on another occasion, he said that when someone worked the way he worked, that is, if someone were to share his yoke, they would discover that they are not really working at all, in the usual sense of trying to keep oneself alive. He said that his workers would find Sabbath, or rest, 7 days a week, rest for their souls, as he called it. And that is because Jesus taught his followers to stop working for mammon and start working for God. God, the loving Heavenly Father who made the 4th commandment as a symbol of his great love for mankind, really wants to redeem us from the curse that befell Adam in the garden and take us back to a world where every day is a holiday or holy day. Jesus summarized the misunderstanding so beautifully when he said, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." In those few words, he gives us an entirely different perspective on the God of the Old Testament. He shows us a loving Heavenly Father, at worst shouting to the kids upstairs, "Don't make me come up there. It's time to get to sleep, so be quiet and settle down." Are such fathers cruel? Or are they just teaching rambunctious kids that they need to slow down and rest periodically for their own good? This same observation can be extended to all of the Torah, or law of the Old Testament. The laws were never ends in themselves. The God behind the laws is infallible, eternal, unchanging. And he gave us those laws, to the extent that Moses and others were able to understand them, but he did it for the purpose of helping us to live a better, more satisfying life for the good of all. I would like to sum up with 2 important lessons about the God of the Old Testament, which I hope you will take with you from watching this video. One is that the real God of the Old Testament is much bigger than the Old Testament itself. The Old Testament has come from him, but it is an imperfect representation of his love, only because it was restricted by what could be perceived through the eyes of fallible Old Testament people. The other lesson is that God's rules are all meant to help us more fully enjoy the life that he has given us. I have focused on the 4th commandment about resting, but rules about not stealing, not killing, and not committing adultery are also there for the simple purpose of helping us to more fully enjoy the life and the world that Jehovah God has given us. He is not a cruel God, not even when he seems to be harsh. Please watch for our 4th and final video in this series, where we look at David and Solomon, the two greatest kings of Israel. In that video, we will consider such things as Old Testament instructions to kill every man, woman, and child when Israel was at war with its neighbors. How does that fit in with the God of love that Jesus came to promote? Please subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so, and don't forget to click on the notification icon so that you will be kept informed when new videos come out. Because YouTube has shadow banned us, that is almost the only way that you will hear about us and what we are saying. Thank you for listening, and God bless you.